Welcome. This is a calm story. Tonight, we explore one of the mysteries of our world. You can listen with curiosity, or you can simply relax. There is nothing you need to do. Just listen, and let the story begin. Long before books existed, long before writing learned how to stay still, humans were already searching for ways to remember. Memory was fragile then. It lived in voices, in gestures, in repetition. And when a voice was lost, so was everything it carried. In what is now southeastern Turkey, people gathered on a gentle hill and began to shape stone in a way the world had never seen before. This place is known today as Göbekli Tepe. It was built more than 11,000 years ago, at a time when humans had no cities, no agriculture, and no written language. Massive stone pillars were carved and raised upright. Their surfaces were covered with animals and symbols that appear again and again. Foxes, birds, serpents, abstract shapes arranged with care, as if they followed rules now forgotten. These carvings were not casual decoration. They were deliberate, repeated, remembered. In a world without writing, stone became a form of memory. These pillars may have helped stories and beliefs remain stable across generations. By fixing meaning into something heavy and enduring, people gave their knowledge a chance to outlast them. This was not a library of books. It was a library of stone. Knowledge held in place, open to the sky, waiting quietly for minds that once knew how to read it. And as time continued to move forward, humans began to understand that memory did not always need to be carved or seen. Sometimes, it could be carried by sound itself. On the Mediterranean island of Malta, beneath layers of earth and stone, lies an underground space carved carefully into living rock. This place is known as the Hypogeum of Halsaflini. It was shaped more than 5,000 years ago, long before written records existed on the island. Deep within its chambers is a room with an unusual quality. When a voice speaks there, especially a low and steady voice, the sound does not fade as it normally would. Instead, it spreads through the space. It resonates. The walls seem to answer back, carrying the voice farther than expected. This acoustic effect was not accidental. The room was shaped deliberately to respond to certain frequencies. Some researchers believe it was used for ritual speech, chanting, or sacred instruction. Words spoken there would have felt powerful, amplified by the stone itself. In a world without writing, sound was a way to preserve knowledge. Repetition made ideas last. Rhythm made them memorable. The chamber may have helped important words stay alive, passed from voice to voice, generation after generation. Here, the stone did not hold symbols. It held echoes. Knowledge lived in vibration rather than ink. This was a library made of sound, where memory traveled through the air and settled briefly in the bodies of those who listened. Far to the east, along wide river plains, another civilization was finding its own way to hold knowledge in place. Cities rose in the Indus Valley with careful planning. Streets followed clear patterns. Water flowed through hidden channels. Trade connected distant regions. Order was everywhere, and with that order came symbols. Small seals and tablets were pressed with markings that repeat again and again across hundreds of sites. Short sequences of signs appear on pottery, on tools, on objects meant to travel. These symbols were not random. They followed rules. They were arranged with intention. Today, we call this system the Indus Valley Script. Yet no one alive can read it. No long texts survive. No bilingual inscriptions remain to offer a key. What we see may only be fragments of a much larger archive, once written on materials that could not survive time. Wood, cloth, palm leaves. Entire libraries may have existed, leaving behind almost no physical trace. These symbols suggest administration, trade, ritual, or law. But without context, their meaning floats just beyond reach. The knowledge they carried has become silent, locked inside shapes that refuse to open. The Indus script reminds us that preservation is never guaranteed. A civilization can be organized, skilled, and vast, and still lose its written voice entirely. Here, the absence itself becomes the record. This may be one of the greatest lost libraries in human history, not because it burned or collapsed, but because it faded quietly, leaving us with marks that still wait patiently to be understood. Across the ocean, in the ancient lands of Mesoamerica, another early civilization left behind a different kind of silence. The Olmec were master stone carvers. They shaped colossal heads and monuments that still feel heavy with intention. Their society was organized, ceremonial, and deeply symbolic. And yet, almost nothing remains of their written knowledge. Later Mesoamerican cultures left painted codices, books made of folded bark paper. But the Olmec came earlier. Some researchers believe they may have recorded information in stone instead. Carved symbols, marked slabs, perhaps even something like stone codices, meant to endure longer than fragile paper. If such records existed, they were exposed to time, weather, and human destruction. Stone can last, but meaning does not always survive the centuries. Symbols erode. Context disappears. What once was readable becomes decoration, then mystery. The absence of Olmec texts does not mean the absence of Olmec knowledge. It means that whatever system they used did not survive in a form we can still understand. Their library, if it existed, was open to the elements, unprotected, and eventually unreadable. Here, loss did not come through fire or conquest alone. It came through slow erosion and forgetting. Knowledge dissolved back into the landscape, leaving only questions behind. As this first chapter of memory gently closes, we are left with an understanding that will return again and again. Before books, knowledge still mattered. It was carved, echoed, and shaped into the world itself. And from these early experiments in preservation, something new would soon emerge. As centuries passed, knowledge began to settle into more stable forms. Symbols turned into writing. Memory found a new surface. And for the first time, collections of texts began to exist not as isolated objects, but as groups meant to be kept together. In the ancient city of Ebla, in what is now northern Syria, thousands of clay tablets were carefully stored in rooms that collapsed and sealed them in place. When they were rediscovered, more than 4,000 years later, they revealed something unexpected. Many of these tablets were written in the local Ebloite language, but alongside them were texts written in Sumerian, a language from far to the south. These tablets included word lists, translations, and parallel texts, suggesting that scribes at Ebla were studying Sumerian deliberately. This means Ebla was not only recording its own affairs, it was preserving foreign knowledge. Learning another language required reference texts, repeated copying, and comparison. The tablets suggest an early form of scholarly study, where older traditions were kept alive even outside their original homeland. In these rooms of clay, we see one of the first true libraries taking shape. Not just storage, but selection. Not just records, but learning. Knowledge was no longer tied only to place or ritual. It could travel, be studied, and be preserved across cultures. Ebler's tablets remind us that the earliest libraries were already international. They reached backward into older traditions, quietly ensuring that earlier voices would not be entirely lost. Farther east, on the open plains of northern Mesopotamia, another kind of library was taking shape. Not one built for myth or ritual, but for order, for management, for the quiet, constant work of keeping a city alive. At Tel Leilon, archaeologists uncovered rooms filled with clay tablets arranged deliberately, many of them fallen where they were once stored. These were not sacred texts or literary works. They were administrative records, lists of grain, counts of livestock, labor assignments, deliveries marked carefully by date and place. This was a bureaucratic archive, one of the earliest we know of. Each tablet captured a small moment of daily life, pressed into clay while the information was still fresh. Once dried, it became fixed, reliable, difficult to change. Such collections required routine, trained scribes, standard formats, the same symbols written again and again, so that anyone trained in the system could understand them. Knowledge here was practical, but essential. Without it, the city could not function. At Tel Leilon, the library was not a quiet place of study. It was an engine, a place where information moved constantly, shaping decisions about food, labor, and survival. This was knowledge used immediately, then stored for reference. These tablets show us that libraries did not begin only as places of wisdom. They also began as places of control, order preserved in clay, ensuring that a complex society could continue to breathe. Along the Mediterranean coast, in the city of Ugarit, knowledge found a more personal home. This was a busy port city, connected to distant cultures by ships, trade routes, and ideas. And within its houses, something new was beginning to appear. Archaeologists discovered clay tablets not only in palaces and temples, but inside private homes. These were not random documents. They included letters, contracts, literary texts, myths, and even instructional writings. Some houses belonged to scribes, officials, or merchants who kept their own small collections. These private libraries suggest that knowledge was no longer confined to institutions alone. Individuals could gather texts for their own use, study, or prestige. A household might contain a few carefully chosen works, copied and stored with intention. In Ugarit, writing was also unusually flexible. Texts appeared in several languages and scripts, including an early alphabetic system. This made reading and copying faster and allowed more people to participate in written culture. These home libraries were modest in size, but important in meaning. They show that knowledge was becoming portable, personal, and valued beyond official record keeping. A text could belong to a person, not just a city or a god. Here, the idea of a library quietly expanded. It could exist in a single room, on a single shelf, waiting patiently for its owner to return and read once more. In the cities of Mesopotamia, knowledge also learned how to teach itself. As writing became more complex, it could no longer be learned casually. It required training, repetition, and guidance. And so, spaces dedicated to learning began to appear. These were scribal schools, often attached to temples or administrative buildings. Inside them, students practiced writing on clay tablets, copying the same signs again and again. Lists of words, names of objects, phrases used in contracts or rituals. Many of these practice tablets have survived, small and imperfect, bearing the marks of learning hands. Over time, these schools accumulated texts, model contracts, literary excerpts, mathematical problems, hymns and prayers. The tablets were kept nearby so students could copy them, compare them, and memorize their forms. Together, they formed working collections of knowledge. These were not libraries meant for quiet contemplation. They were active spaces. Tablets were handled daily, reused, sometimes erased and written over. Knowledge here was alive, shaped by use and repetition rather than preservation alone. Yet without these school collections, much would have been lost. By copying older texts, students helped them survive. Each exercise tablet became a bridge between generations, carrying forward forms and ideas that might otherwise have disappeared. In these humble rooms of learning, surrounded by clay and dust, libraries began to serve a new purpose. Not just to store knowledge, but to teach it, one careful sign at a time. As writing became more trusted, knowledge began to gather around places of worship. Temples were not only houses of the divine, they were centers of organization, wealth, and long memory. And within their walls, collections of texts slowly grew. Temple libraries held hymns, prayers, ritual instructions, and omens. But they also preserved medical texts, astronomical observations, legal formulas, and scholarly commentaries. Priests were often scholars as well, trained to read signs in the sky, the body, and the world itself. These collections were not passive. Texts were consulted, copied, updated, and debated. A priest might compare older versions of a ritual to newer ones. Astronomical records were extended night after night. Medical knowledge was refined through experience. The temple became a place where ideas were tested and improved. In this way, temple libraries functioned like early think tanks. They gathered knowledge, reflected on it, and applied it to real problems, disease, weather, political decisions, and divine interpretation. Information here shaped how a society understood itself and its future. Because temples were stable institutions, their libraries benefited from continuity. Texts could remain in one place for generations. Knowledge was not only preserved, but deepened over time. Within these sacred spaces, libraries became engines of thought. Quiet rooms where the past informed the present, and careful records helped guide what came next. As knowledge proved its value, it moved closer to power. Kings and rulers began to understand that information itself could strengthen a kingdom. And so, libraries found their way inside royal palaces. Within palace walls, clay tablets were gathered that recorded treaties, laws, tribute lists, and royal correspondence. These texts documented alliances and rivalries, borders and obligations. To rule meant to remember, and the palace library became a tool of memory for the state. These collections were often kept near administrative offices, close to the people who needed them most. Scribes worked quietly, copying and organizing tablets, so that decisions could be based on what had already been agreed, promised, or recorded. Knowledge here was strategic. It supported authority. But palace libraries did not hold only official documents. They sometimes included myths, epics, omens, and scholarly texts copied from temples and schools. A ruler who possessed knowledge also possessed prestige. To own ancient texts was to claim connection to the past and legitimacy in the present. Inside these palaces, libraries were both practical and symbolic. They helped govern daily affairs, and they projected an image of wisdom and continuity. Power was no longer measured only in armies or wealth, but also in what could be remembered, referenced, and preserved. Knowledge, now sheltered by stone walls and guarded halls, had become part of the machinery of rule. Along the Euphrates River, the city of Mari became one of the great listening points of the ancient world. Positioned between regions and empires, it received news, requests, warnings, and promises from far beyond its walls. And all of it was written down. Inside the royal palace of Mari, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, letters from governors, messages from allies, reports from spies and envoys, instructions sent outward, and replies carefully returned. This was not a small collection. It was a vast diplomatic archive, alive with movement and urgency. Each tablet captured a moment of political life, a border dispute, a marriage alliance, a warning of unrest. Taken together, they formed a continuous conversation stretching across years and regions. The palace scribes organized these texts so they could be consulted again, sometimes long after the original sender was gone. For the rulers of Mari, memory was power. Knowing what had been promised, who had offended whom, and which alliances were fragile could determine survival. The library made it possible to act with awareness instead of guesswork. Yet there is something quietly human in these tablets. Amid strategy and command, there are traces of anxiety, hope, delay, and misunderstanding. The archive preserves not only decisions, but voices. When Mari fell, its palace collapsed, sealing the tablets beneath layers of debris. Fire baked the clay harder, preserving it by accident. What was once a living system of communication became a frozen record of an ancient world thinking, negotiating, and remembering. Here, the library was not silent. It was a city speaking to itself across time. As collections grew larger, they needed structure. Knowledge could no longer be left in piles or baskets. It had to be placed, arranged, and retrieved. And so, ancient libraries began to develop their own physical order. Clay tablets were stored upright or laid flat on shelves made of wood or built directly into walls. Some shelves were simple ledges. Others were carefully constructed niches, sized to fit groups of tablets. Larger tablets might rest on the floor, while smaller ones were stacked together. In some libraries, tablets were grouped by subject or purpose. Administrative records in one area, ritual texts in another, letters and reports kept close to the offices that used them most. The placement itself became a form of knowledge, guiding the hand toward what was needed. Because clay is heavy and fragile, handling required care. Tablets were often wrapped in cloth or placed inside protective envelopes made of clay. These envelopes sometimes bore summaries of the contents inside, allowing a reader to identify a text without opening it. Shelving was not merely practical. It was a way of thinking. To place a tablet somewhere was to decide how it related to others. The physical space of the library mirrored the mental space of those who used it. In these quiet rooms, knowledge took on weight and position. It rested patiently, waiting to be lifted again into use. As shelves filled and collections expanded, another challenge quietly emerged. How could a reader find the right text among so many similar tablets and scrolls? The solution was simple and surprisingly elegant. Ancient libraries often identified texts by their opening words. Instead of titles as we know them today, a work was known by its first line. These opening phrases became anchors of memory. A scribe did not ask for a specific tablet by name, but by how it began. Lists were created that recorded these opening words, sometimes along with brief notes about the text's subject or length. In effect, these were early catalogues. They did not describe the contents in detail, but they were enough to guide an experienced reader toward the correct shelf or container. This system worked well in cultures where texts were memorized and copied regularly. The first line was familiar, often recited aloud. It lived in the mind as much as on the tablet. Cataloging, therefore, relied on shared knowledge between the library and its users. Such catalogs could exist on clay tablets, on wooden boards, or even in memory alone. A senior scribe might know exactly where a text rested, guided by habit and repetition rather than written instruction. Here, order was not rigid. It was organic. The library functioned because its users were trained to think within its system. Knowledge was not only stored, it was remembered, recognized, and called forth by a few carefully chosen words. Not all knowledge was pressed into clay. As writing traveled across regions, lighter materials appeared, and with them, new ways of storing and protecting texts. Scrolls made of papyrus or parchment were rolled tightly and placed inside containers. Some were simple ceramic jars. Others were wooden boxes, leather cases, or woven baskets designed to keep out light, dust, and insects. In drier climates, these containers could preserve texts for centuries. Scrolls were often stored vertically, standing on their ends, or laid horizontally in stacked layers. Small tags or labels might be attached, indicating the opening words or the author. In some libraries, these labels faced outward, allowing readers to scan a collection without unrolling anything. To save space, scrolls were sometimes stored in wall niches or placed inside large cupboards with painted doors. These cupboards did more than hide texts. They protected them from temperature changes and accidental damage. Libraries also adapted to movement. Portable containers allowed texts to travel with officials, scholars, or priests. Knowledge was no longer tied to a single room. It could accompany a person on a journey, ready to be consulted when needed. These storage tricks reflect careful thought. Every container, every shelf, was shaped by experience. Over time, librarians learned what worked, quietly refining the art of keeping words safe. In many ancient libraries, different forms of writing lived side by side. Clay tablets shared space with papyrus scrolls. Later, parchment sheets joined them. Each material had its strengths, and each carried knowledge in a slightly different way. Clay was durable and resistant to time, but heavy and difficult to transport. Papyrus was light and flexible, ideal for long texts and travel, but vulnerable to moisture and insects. Parchment was stronger and could be reused, though it required more labor to produce. Libraries learned to adapt. Important legal or ritual texts might be copied onto clay for permanence. Literary works and letters often appeared on papyrus for convenience. Scholarly notes could move between materials as needed. This mixture required careful organization. Different shelves, different containers, different handling techniques. A reader needed to know not only what they were looking for, but how it was stored and how to treat it. The coexistence of materials also meant copying never truly stopped. Texts were transferred from one medium to another as circumstances changed. Knowledge was not static. It flowed, reshaped by the surfaces that carried it. In these mixed collections, libraries became living systems. They balanced durability with flexibility, permanence with access. Each material whispered its own instructions on how knowledge should be held, preserved, and passed on. Even in the ancient world, caretakers understood that texts could weaken with time. Surfaces cracked, edges frayed, ink faded, and so, libraries quietly developed methods to extend the life of their collections. Damaged tablets could be recopied, line by line, onto fresh clay. Cracks were sometimes smoothed, broken pieces reassembled, or older texts reinforced with protective envelopes. For scrolls, repairs were more delicate. Torn papyrus might be patched with thin strips, carefully glued into place. Parchment offered another option. Faded writing could be scraped away, allowing the material to be reused. This practice, though practical, sometimes erased older knowledge to make room for new texts. Preservation and loss were closely intertwined. Libraries also paid attention to environment. Texts were kept away from damp air, direct sunlight, and smoke. Containers were sealed. Shelves were cleaned. Insects were discouraged using oils, herbs, or smoke from certain plants. Repair was not dramatic work. It happened slowly, quietly, often unnoticed. But without it, collections would have vanished far sooner. Each act of care was a decision to let knowledge continue. Through these small gestures, libraries showed an awareness of time. They recognized that words, like people, required attention if they were to endure. Libraries were not sealed vaults. Knowledge moved. It passed from hand to hand, from place to place, guided by trust, reputation, and need. In many ancient societies, texts could be borrowed, especially among scholars, priests, or officials. A tablet or scroll might leave its shelf temporarily to be copied, studied, or consulted elsewhere. Sometimes the borrower produced a copy and returned the original. Other times, the text itself traveled. This movement required systems. Notes were added. Clay tags recorded ownership. In some cases, warnings were written directly onto texts, reminding the reader to return them. These were early forms of circulation control, shaped more by social obligation than formal rules. Because copying was labor-intensive, access was valuable. To borrow a text meant being trusted. Libraries functioned within networks of relationships, where reputation mattered as much as written permission. Circulation also allowed ideas to spread. A medical recipe copied in one city could appear generations later in another. Astronomical observations traveled across regions. Knowledge flowed quietly, leaving faint trails in surviving texts. Through these exchanges, libraries extended far beyond their walls. They became nodes in a larger system, connected by human movement and memory. As collections expanded, some libraries began to organize knowledge by focus rather than form. Certain rooms, shelves, or containers were devoted to specific kinds of understanding. These were specialist collections, shaped by long observation and careful use. Medical texts gathered recipes, diagnoses, and instructions for treatment. They described symptoms, remedies, and the careful balance between body and environment. These works were consulted often, annotated, and copied with care because their knowledge touched daily life. Astronomical collections followed the sky. They recorded the movement of stars, planets, and eclipses across generations. These texts were cumulative. Each observation built upon earlier ones, turning the library into a memory that extended beyond a single lifetime. Rhetorical and literary collections preserved speeches, debates, and exemplary writings. Students studied these works to learn persuasion, style, and structure. Words here were tools, sharpened through repetition. By grouping texts in this way, libraries allowed deeper study. A reader could remain within one domain, comparing works and noticing patterns. Knowledge became layered, with older texts supporting newer interpretations. These specialist collections show that ancient libraries were not chaotic accumulations. They were curated spaces, reflecting priorities and values. Certain kinds of knowledge were gathered, protected, and passed forward with special care. Beyond study and administration, many texts were meant to be used in moments of ceremony and belief. In ancient libraries, writing was not only read, it was spoken, performed, and activated. Ritual texts guided prayers, offerings, and sacred actions. The precise wording mattered. A single mistake could change the meaning of a ceremony. For this reason, such texts were copied with exceptional care and stored in protected spaces. Omens and divination manuals were consulted during times of uncertainty. A priest might read from a tablet before interpreting a dream, an illness, or an unusual event in the sky. The text acted as a bridge between the human and the divine. Some writings were believed to carry power simply by existing. Protective spells, blessings, and incantations were stored even when rarely read. Their presence alone was thought to safeguard a place or a person. In these moments, the library became more than a collection. It became a sacred instrument. Knowledge was not passive information, but a force that could shape reality when handled correctly. As this chapter closes, we see that ancient libraries were not uniform. They served many roles at once: practical, intellectual, political, and spiritual. And with each use, the bond between knowledge and human life grew deeper. In one quiet corner of the ancient world, a single private collection would change the future of libraries forever. Aristotle, student of Plato and teacher of Alexander, gathered texts not as symbols of prestige, but as tools for thinking. His collection was wide and deliberate. Works on philosophy, biology, politics, poetry, and logic sat side by side. He did not separate knowledge into sacred and secular. Everything could be studied, compared, questioned. Texts were read closely, annotated, and cross-referenced through memory and discussion. Unlike earlier collections, Aristotle's library was actively used as part of daily research. Students gathered around texts, not to recite them, but to analyze them. Observations from nature were checked against written theories. Ideas were tested, refined, and sometimes rejected. This approach transformed the role of a library. It was no longer just a place where knowledge rested. It became a workspace, a laboratory of thought. The collection supported inquiry rather than tradition alone. After Aristotle's death, stories tell of his books being preserved, hidden, copied, and eventually influencing the great libraries that followed. Whether every detail is true or not, the impact is clear. His way of organizing and using texts shaped how future scholars imagined what a library could be. Here, knowledge stopped being static. Surrounded by books, thought itself learned how to move. After the age of individual scholars, libraries began to grow into something larger. In the Hellenistic world, they were designed not merely to store books, but to support discovery itself. These libraries were often connected to schools, observatories, and lecture halls. Scholars lived nearby, supported by patrons or rulers who believed that knowledge strengthened the state. Texts were gathered aggressively, copied meticulously, and made available for study. Here, research became collective. One scholar might compare multiple versions of a poem. Another might chart the movement of stars, using records accumulated over generations. Geography, medicine, mathematics, and history all advanced within these shared spaces. Librarians themselves became scholars. They corrected texts, identified errors, and established authoritative versions. Reading was no longer passive. It involved comparison, debate, and revision. In these institutions, the library shaped the rhythm of intellectual life. Days were organized around reading, teaching, and discussion. Knowledge advanced not in isolation, but through quiet collaboration. This model marked a turning point. The library was no longer just a memory of the past. It became a place where the future was written, slowly, through careful study and shared inquiry. As collections expanded beyond what memory alone could manage, libraries needed new tools to remain usable. This is where catalogues quietly transformed everything. In major Hellenistic libraries, texts were organized using detailed lists known as pinoks. These catalogues recorded authors, titles or opening lines, subjects, and sometimes brief notes about a work's contents. They did not merely list what existed. They imposed structure on vast seas of knowledge. A scholar could consult a pinax to locate a work without wandering blindly through shelves and cupboards. Subjects were grouped. Authors were compared. The catalogue itself became a map of learning. Creating these catalogues required deep familiarity with the collection. Librarians read widely, judged authenticity, and decided where a text belonged. Their choices shaped how knowledge was understood and accessed for generations. The pinoks also preserved memory. Even if a text was lost or damaged, its entry might survive in the catalogue, leaving a trace of what once existed. In this way, catalogues became ghost libraries, recording absence as well as presence. Through these lists, libraries gained a second life. Not just as physical spaces, but as organized systems of thought, navigable and meaningful even at immense scale. On the island of Rhodes, knowledge was organized with an unusual sense of clarity. This was a center of learning, known especially for rhetoric, law, and science. And within its libraries, texts were arranged with growing attention to subject. Rather than relying only on authors or opening words, collections in Rhodes appear to have grouped works by discipline. Texts on rhetoric rested together. Legal writings formed their own cluster. Scientific works followed another path. This made comparison easier, study deeper, and teaching more focused. Such organization suggests a change in how people thought about knowledge itself. Subjects were no longer just convenient labels. They were recognized as distinct fields, each with its own methods and traditions. For students, this meant immersion. A learner could spend long hours within a single area of study, moving from one text to the next without interruption. The library supported concentration and continuity. This early form of subject cataloging did not replace older systems. It layered itself on top of them. Memory, opening lines, authorship, and subject all worked together, quietly increasing the library's usefulness. In Rhodes, the library began to resemble something familiar to us today. Not just a storehouse, but an organized landscape of ideas, shaped to guide the mind gently from one thought to the next. In the city of Pergamum, the growth of libraries encountered a practical limit. Papyrus, long relied upon for scrolls, was fragile and increasingly scarce. Whether through rivalry, trade disruption, or simple necessity, librarians and scribes began to look for alternatives. Their solution was parchment. Made from carefully prepared animal skins, parchment was stronger than papyrus and far more durable. It could be folded, scraped, and reused. It resisted humidity better and lasted longer under frequent handling. For libraries meant to support active study, this mattered deeply. Pergamum's scribes refined the production of parchment to a high standard. Texts copied onto it could survive decades of use. Errors could be corrected. Margins could hold notes. Knowledge gained flexibility. This innovation changed how libraries functioned. Collections became more resilient. Scholars could work more intensively with texts without fear of destroying them. Over time, parchment helped enable the transition from scroll to codex, from rolling to turning pages. What began as a material solution reshaped intellectual life. Libraries were no longer constrained by the fragility of their tools. Knowledge gained a tougher skin, able to endure closer contact with the human mind. As libraries grew in value, they became instruments of diplomacy. Knowledge itself turned into a gift, offered not only to educate, but to impress, to bind, and to influence. Rulers exchanged books as signs of respect and alliance. A collection sent from one city to another carried prestige. It suggested openness, trust, and cultural refinement. To receive rare texts was to be recognized as worthy of them. Some libraries expanded through these exchanges. Copies were made before books were sent away. New works arrived in return. Through this quiet circulation, ideas crossed borders more easily than armies ever could. Diplomatic libraries also reflected power balances. A ruler who could afford to give away texts demonstrated abundance. A ruler who received them signaled participation in a shared intellectual world. These exchanges left subtle marks. Similar texts appear in distant libraries. Styles of scholarship travel. Even disagreements spread, preserved through copied argument and response. Here, the library became a language of its own, a way for states to speak to one another through learning rather than force. Knowledge moved softly, yet its influence endured. As empires expanded, libraries took on another meaning. They became symbols of conquest. To take a city was not only to seize land and people, but to claim its knowledge. Victorious rulers gathered books from conquered regions and transported them to imperial centers. These texts represented the intellectual wealth of the defeated, now absorbed into the identity of the empire. Possessing them was a declaration. The past now belonged to the victor. Some libraries grew precisely because of this practice. Collections became vast mosaics of cultures, languages, and traditions. Texts once kept apart now sat side by side, reshaped by new political realities. This accumulation was not always gentle. Original contexts were lost. Local traditions were sometimes stripped of meaning. Yet preservation often followed conquest. Texts that might have vanished were copied, catalogued, and kept alive within imperial libraries. In this way, conquest both destroyed and saved knowledge. Libraries stood at the center of this paradox. They reflected power, but also continuity. Within their shelves, the voices of many worlds coexisted, some freely, some unwillingly, bound together by the reach of empire and the enduring weight of written memory. In Rome, libraries took on a carefully balanced form. The empire ruled many cultures, and its leaders understood that authority rested not only on law and force, but on language itself. Public libraries in Rome were often built as paired spaces. One room held texts in Greek, the language of philosophy, science, and ancient learning. The other held texts in Latin, the language of administration, law, and Roman identity. Together, they reflected the dual foundations of Roman thought. Readers moved between these rooms, aware that each language carried its own weight. Greek connected Rome to an older intellectual tradition. Latin shaped how that tradition was applied, governed, and transformed. These twin libraries were architectural statements. They showed respect for inherited knowledge while asserting Roman continuity. Wisdom was not rejected, but absorbed and reorganized. By housing both traditions side by side, Rome positioned itself as heir rather than outsider. The library became a place where cultures met quietly, where influence flowed in both directions. Here, knowledge was bilingual, layered, and deliberate. And within these paired rooms, the Roman world learned to see itself as both student and master of the past. As Roman society grew more complex, so did its laws. Rules governed land, trade, citizenship, inheritance, and obligation. To manage this growing legal world, texts began to gather in more focused spaces. Specialized legal libraries appeared, often near courts, administrative offices, or schools of law. These collections held statutes, legal opinions, case precedents, and commentaries written by respected jurists. For magistrates and advocates, access to these texts was essential. Roman law was built through interpretation. A single rule could be read differently depending on context. Libraries allowed legal thinkers to compare earlier judgments, trace changes over time, and argue with authority. The written record stabilized justice in a vast empire. Students of law relied on these collections as well. They copied passages, memorized principles, and learned how to reason through complex disputes. The library became a training ground, shaping minds that would later govern provinces far from Rome. These legal libraries show how knowledge could specialize without fragmenting society. By preserving and organizing the law, they helped maintain coherence across distances and generations. Here, the library was not abstract. It shaped daily life, quietly influencing decisions that affected millions, all through the careful preservation of written thought. In Rome, libraries were not always hidden behind columns or reserved for scholars alone. Sometimes, they appeared in places meant for rest and routine, woven gently into daily life. Public baths were among the most social spaces in the city. People came to wash, to talk, to exercise, and to pass the time. Within some of these bath complexes, small libraries were added, offering shelves of scrolls to those who lingered. These community libraries were modest, but meaningful. A visitor might read while cooling down, waiting for a friend, or resting between rooms. The atmosphere was informal. Knowledge mixed easily with conversation and leisure. The collections often included poetry, history, philosophy, and moral essays. Texts chosen not for administration or ritual, but for reflection and enjoyment. Reading became part of public life, accessible without ceremony. By placing libraries in baths, Rome made a quiet statement. Learning was not separate from living. It belonged in shared spaces, alongside water, warmth, and human connection. Here, the library stepped fully into the city. No longer distant or solemn, it became a companion to ordinary moments, waiting patiently for anyone curious enough to reach for a scroll. In the city of Ephesus, the idea of public access reached a new clarity. The Library of Celsus stood prominently along a busy street, its facade open and inviting. This was not a hidden archive. It was a civic monument. Built to honor a Roman official, the library served the public as well. Citizens could enter, consult texts, and spend time among shelves designed for use, not display alone. The building itself was engineered for reading, with light, space, and organization carefully considered. Inside, niches held scrolls arranged for reference. The structure protected them from heat and moisture, showing careful planning for long-term access. Knowledge here was meant to last and to be shared. The Library of Celsus symbolized a shift. Learning was no longer confined to elites or institutions alone. It was part of civic identity. To build a library was to invest in the intellectual life of the city. As this chapter closes, libraries stand revealed as engines of civilization. They shaped thought, law, science, and culture. They connected past to present and present to future. From here, the story will turn toward the spaces themselves, the architecture that held knowledge and gave it form. As libraries became permanent features of cities, their spaces began to matter as much as their contents. Architecture itself learned how to support thought. Reading rooms were designed with care, often oriented to capture natural light without exposing texts to direct sun. High windows admitted a soft glow, enough to read by, while deep walls shielded shelves from heat. Light was treated as a tool, shaped and controlled. The placement of benches, tables, and niches encouraged stillness. Sound softened within thick stone walls. These rooms were not crowded. They invited focus. To enter was to slow down, to align the body with the quiet rhythm of reading. Architects understood that knowledge required comfort as well as protection. A well-lit room reduced strain. A stable environment preserved materials. Thought flowed more easily when the space itself offered calm. In these carefully designed rooms, architecture became an invisible partner in learning. The building did not speak, but it guided. It shaped attention gently, allowing the mind to rest inside the light. Fire was one of the greatest threats to ancient libraries. Oil lamps, torches, wooden shelves, and dry scrolls all shared the same space. Architects learned, through loss, how to reduce the danger. Library rooms were often built with thick stone walls and limited openings. Floors were paved rather than wooden. Shelves were sometimes set into masonry, reducing exposed material. In some designs, storage areas were separated from reading spaces, lowering the risk of flame reaching the collections. Open fires were kept away. Light was carefully managed. In larger complexes, libraries were placed near courtyards or open-air spaces, where smoke could escape and heat could dissipate. Some buildings included water features nearby, fountains, baths, or cisterns, offering a nearby source for emergencies. While not formal fire systems, these choices reflect awareness and planning. These architectural decisions did not eliminate risk, but they show intent. Libraries were valued enough to be protected thoughtfully. Each wall and doorway carried lessons learned from earlier destruction. Here, architecture became a guardian, silent, patient, and imperfect, but always standing between fragile words and sudden loss. As knowledge expanded, a single room was no longer enough. Libraries grew outward, becoming part of larger scholarly complexes designed to support many kinds of activity at once. These complexes included multiple reading rooms, storage areas, lecture halls, courtyards, and living spaces for scholars. Texts were kept close to places of discussion, teaching, and reflection. Movement between rooms mirrored movement between ideas. A scholar might consult a text, walk into a nearby hall to debate it, then return to the shelves to verify a passage. Architecture supported this rhythm. Walls guided thought as much as they guided footsteps. Courtyards provided light and air, easing the strain of long study. Covered walkways allowed quiet movement. The entire complex functioned as a single intellectual organism. In such spaces, the library was no longer isolated. It was integrated into daily scholarly life. Learning became spatial, unfolding across rooms designed to encourage connection and continuity. These multi-room designs reveal a deep understanding. Knowledge thrives not only in storage, but in conversation, movement, and shared presence. In some cities, libraries were built not only to preserve knowledge, but to preserve memory itself. They became places where learning and remembrance quietly merged. Certain libraries were combined with tombs, monuments, or memorial halls. A visitor might read among shelves while standing near the resting place of a patron, scholar, or ruler. The presence of the dead added gravity to the written word. This pairing carried meaning. Knowledge was presented as a legacy, something passed forward beyond a single life. To read in such a space was to participate in continuity, linking past minds with present ones. The architecture reinforced this idea. Inscriptions honored donors. Portraits or reliefs reminded visitors of those who made the library possible. The building itself became a message. Learning endures longer than the body. The Library of Celsus, with its tomb beneath the floor, is one such example. Above, texts were consulted. Below, memory rested. Together, they formed a single statement about permanence. In these spaces, libraries spoke softly about time. They reminded readers that knowledge survives because someone cared enough to preserve it, and to be remembered for doing so. Within many ancient libraries, knowledge was given a face. Statues and symbolic decoration filled the spaces between shelves, quietly shaping how readers felt as they moved through the room. Figures of gods associated with wisdom stood watch. Athena, Apollo, Hermes. Alongside them appeared statues of poets, philosophers, historians, and lawgivers. These were not mere ornaments. They formed a silent community of minds from the past. To read beneath their gaze was to feel part of a longer conversation. The presence of these figures reminded readers that they were entering a tradition, not reading alone. Thought had ancestors. Decoration also carried meaning through symbols. Reliefs of scrolls, muses, or cosmic imagery hinted at the scope of knowledge held within the walls. Ceilings and friezes elevated the act of reading, giving it dignity and calm. These visual elements shaped behavior. Voices softened, movements slowed. The space encouraged respect, not through rules, but through atmosphere. In this way, libraries taught without words. Before a text was opened, the space itself had already prepared the mind. Books were not always visible on open shelves. In many ancient libraries, they rested inside cupboards. Wooden armoires carefully built to protect fragile texts from dust, light, and touch. These cupboards were often painted or decorated. Doors bore geometric patterns, symbolic colors, or simple inscriptions indicating the kind of texts stored within. Some were adorned with mythological scenes or protective motifs. suggesting that what lay inside was valuable, even vulnerable. Decoration served a practical role as well. By marking cupboards visually, librarians made navigation easier. A reader could recognize a section at a glance, guided by color or image rather than written labels alone. When the doors were closed, the room felt calm and orderly. When opened, knowledge revealed itself slowly, one scroll or tablet at a time. This rhythm encouraged care. Texts were not grabbed impulsively. They were chosen. These cupboards turned storage into ceremony. Opening one was an intentional act, a small moment of transition between the outer world and the inner space of reading. Here, protection and beauty worked together. Architecture did not merely guard knowledge. It honored it, allowing words to rest quietly until they were needed again. Not all libraries were enclosed by walls. In many ancient cities, knowledge spilled outward into public space, carved directly into stone. Inscriptions appeared on temples, monuments, and civic buildings. Laws were engraved where all could see them. Decrees, calendars, honors, and records of events lined streets and plazas. These texts were meant to last, exposed to weather and time. In this way, the city itself became a library. Walls served as shelves. Stone became a page. Anyone who walked slowly enough could read. These public inscriptions extended the reach of knowledge beyond formal collections. They ensured that essential information could not be hidden away or easily altered. Memory was fixed in place, shared openly. Unlike scrolls or tablets, these texts could not be borrowed or moved. They belonged to the space itself. Knowledge was anchored, woven into daily life and movement. As this chapter closes, architecture stands revealed as more than shelter. It shaped how knowledge was stored, accessed, protected, and displayed. Words lived in rooms, cupboards, courtyards, and streets. The story now turns towards something more fragile. The many ways libraries were lost, damaged, or transformed by time. Not all losses were sudden. Some came through fire, others through use, and some through strange accidents that preserved what should have vanished. Fire destroyed countless libraries, yet it also saved some. When buildings collapsed and burned, clay tablets were baked harder, turning fragile records into durable ones. What was meant to erase memory sometimes sealed it instead. Reuse was another quiet force. Texts were handled, copied, and worn down by repetition. A tablet used daily might crack. A scroll might fray at the edges. Knowledge survived through use, but use also carried risk. Then there were accidents. Collapses that buried rooms. Floods that sealed spaces in mud. Abandoned cities that froze collections in time. Preservation often came not from care, but from being forgotten in the right way. These contradictions remind us that survival was never planned perfectly. Libraries lived between intention and chance. They endured not because they were invincible, but because the world sometimes paused around them. Knowledge survived when destruction arrived unevenly, when fire burned but did not consume, when reuse stopped abruptly, when disaster became shelter. Some libraries survived not because of human care, but because of where they were. Climate became an unseen ally in the preservation of knowledge. In dry deserts, papyrus and parchment resisted decay. Heat discouraged mold. Low humidity slowed the breakdown of fibers and ink. Scrolls left undisturbed in such environments could sleep for centuries. Caves, sealed rooms, and underground spaces created stable conditions. Temperature changed slowly. Light rarely entered. In these quiet places, texts aged gently, almost suspended in time. By contrast, libraries in damp or variable climates suffered more. Moisture invited insects and rot. Ink bled. Pages fused together. Entire collections vanished simply because the air was wrong. Ancient people noticed these patterns. While they could not control climate, they learned to work with it. Storage rooms were placed deep within buildings. Containers were sealed tightly. Some texts were moved deliberately to safer regions. Climate did not preserve knowledge intentionally. It did so passively, without awareness. Yet its influence shaped what we can still read today. The survival of many ancient texts is, in part, a story of geography, of dry winds, still air, and long silence. Ancient librarians did not rely on chance alone. They developed small, careful practices to protect texts from decay and invasion. Scrolls and parchment were sometimes treated with oils to keep them flexible and to repel insects. These substances darkened the surface slightly, giving the material a longer life. The application was gentle, repeated over time. Fumigation was another method. Libraries were exposed to smoke from selected herbs or resins believed to deter insects and mold. The scent lingered, embedding itself into the space. Knowledge, in these moments, was surrounded by ritual as much as chemistry. Containers were cleaned regularly. Shelves were wiped. Dust was removed not for appearance, but for survival. Each act was small, but together they slowed decay. These practices show awareness rather than certainty. Librarians understood that texts were alive in a way, responsive to air, touch, and time. Care had to be ongoing. Preservation was not dramatic. It happened in quiet routines, repeated patiently, guided by observation and experience rather than theory. One of the simplest ways to protect knowledge was also one of the most effective. Texts were copied, not once, but many times, and spread across different places. Important works were divided into multiple copies, each stored in a different library, temple, or city. If one was lost to fire, flood, or neglect, another might survive elsewhere. Knowledge was no longer held in a single fragile location. This practice required coordination and trust. Scribes copied carefully, knowing that accuracy mattered. Variations appeared over time, but the core ideas endured. A work could change slightly and still survive. Sometimes, copies were intentionally separated. A ruler might send part of a collection as a gift. A scholar might carry texts to a new city. What seemed like loss was often a form of protection. By scattering knowledge, ancient societies reduced the risk of total disappearance. No single disaster could erase everything at once. In this way, survival depended not on strength, but on distribution. Knowledge lived on because it learned how to travel, quietly multiplying itself against time. Over time, those who cared for libraries began to sense patterns of loss. Fires returned. Floods repeated. Wars came and went. From these experiences emerged something subtle, an instinct to prepare. Some libraries stored their most important texts deeper within buildings, away from outer walls. Others duplicated key works and kept copies in separate rooms or locations. Valuable texts were sometimes removed during periods of unrest, hidden until danger passed. There were no formal disaster plans as we know them today, but there was awareness, a sense that knowledge was vulnerable, and that precautions mattered. Decisions were made quietly, guided by memory of earlier destruction. Even architectural choices reflected this instinct. Fewer windows, thicker walls, storage spaces placed above ground to avoid floods, or below ground to avoid fire. Each choice carried trade-offs, learned through experience. These early gestures show something deeply human: the recognition that what has been built can be lost, and the hope that it might be saved with foresight. Here, preservation became intentional. Not guaranteed, not perfect, but thoughtful. Knowledge was no longer only recorded. It was defended. Not all destruction came from accident or neglect. Sometimes, loss was deliberate. As power shifted, texts became dangerous. Ideas written in one era could threaten another. Rulers, councils, or religious authorities ordered certain works removed, banned, or destroyed. Libraries were purged quietly, shelf by shelf. Some texts disappeared because they contradicted official doctrine. Others because they preserved memories that no longer served those in control. Knowledge, once valued, became a liability. Censorship often left uneven traces. One copy survived because it was misfiled. Another because it was stored far from the center of power. Sometimes a text endured only because no one noticed its meaning anymore. These moments remind us that libraries were never neutral spaces. They reflected values, fears, and ambitions. What remained on the shelves was shaped as much by politics as by preservation. Yet even in times of purges, knowledge resisted erasure. Copies survived. Fragments lingered. Ideas resurfaced later, carried forward by chance or quiet defiance. Here, loss was intentional, but survival still found narrow paths through history. As centuries passed and empires shifted, some libraries did not disappear all at once. Instead, they slowly grew smaller. Collections were reduced, narrowed, and reshaped into something quieter. Large, ambitious libraries required resources, space, scribes, funding, protection. When these supports weakened, only the most necessary texts were kept. Administrative records, legal documents, religious works. What remained formed archives rather than libraries in the earlier sense. These archives were practical. They preserved what was needed for continuity, not curiosity. Poetry faded first. Speculation followed. What survived was what had immediate use or authority. Yet this shrinking also brought stability. Smaller collections were easier to protect. They could be hidden, moved, or absorbed into institutions like temples, churches, or courts. Knowledge endured by becoming modest. In this transformation, libraries changed their purpose. They stopped trying to hold everything. They focused on remembering just enough. What looks like decline was sometimes adaptation. By becoming archives, libraries learned how to survive in a narrower world, carrying fragments of the past quietly into the future. When materials became scarce, old texts sometimes gained a second life. Not as knowledge, but as substance. Parchment could be scraped and written over. Papyrus could be cut, folded, or glued into new forms. Clay tablets might be broken and reused as building material. Words were sacrificed so surfaces could live again. This reuse was rarely meant to destroy meaning. It was practical. A faded text no longer read was still valuable as material. A blank surface mattered more than the old words beneath it. Sometimes traces survived. Ghostly letters lingered under new writing. Fragments were hidden inside bindings, covers, or walls. Knowledge slipped into places it was never meant to be seen, waiting quietly. Centuries later, these reused texts would reappear. Scholars learned to read through layers, to recover erased voices. What had been discarded returned as discovery. In these moments, loss became concealment rather than disappearance. Knowledge was not gone. It was sleeping beneath new purposes. Here, survival took an unexpected form. Words endured by becoming invisible, carried forward inside other objects, patient and unnoticed. In the end, the most powerful tool of preservation was not stone, fireproof walls, or clever storage. It was copying. Again and again, texts were rewritten by hand. Scribes copied what they believed mattered. Each copy extended a work's life, sometimes by centuries. Without this repetition, most ancient knowledge would have vanished completely. Copying introduced change. Errors appeared. Interpretations shifted. Margins filled with notes. Yet even altered, a text that survived remained a bridge to the past. This process favored what was valued. Religious works, scientific treatises, legal codes, these were copied most often. Other texts faded, not through destruction, but through neglect. Preservation, then, was selective. Survival reflected choices, priorities, and beliefs. What we have today is not a complete record, but a filtered one. As this chapter closes, we see that fragility and survival were intertwined. Knowledge endured not because it was strong, but because it was cared for, patiently, imperfectly, and again and again. In the city of Nineveh, an Assyrian king set out to do something no ruler had attempted so deliberately before. Ashurbanipal did not merely collect texts. He sought to gather everything. His library was systematic. Scribes were sent across the empire to copy works from temples, schools, and private collections. Tablets were standardized. Subjects were organized. Colophons identified series, authorship, and ownership. This was not an accidental accumulation. It was planned. Ashurbanipal himself could read. He took pride in mastering complex scripts and ancient languages. His library reflected this ambition. It contained myths, rituals, medical texts, astronomical records, omens, and royal correspondence. For the first time, a ruler treated the library as a comprehensive mirror of the world. Knowledge was no longer scattered. It was meant to be centralized, complete, and authoritative. Yet even here, gaps remained. And those absences would prove as revealing as the collection itself. Among the thousands of tablets gathered at Nineveh, patterns begin to appear. Series are carefully ordered. Ritual texts follow expected sequences. Medical and astronomical works align with known traditions. And yet, in the vast collections of omen literature, there are silences. Certain expected tablets are missing. Gaps appear in long divinatory series that should be complete. The sequence begins, continues, and then simply stops. Not because the system ended there, but because something failed to arrive, or failed to survive. These omissions raise quiet questions. Were some tablets never copied? Were they lost in transit? Or were they withheld intentionally, perhaps considered too dangerous, too sacred, or too politically sensitive to include? Omen texts were powerful. They interpreted signs from the gods and could influence royal decisions. Missing sections might represent uncertainty, disagreement, or knowledge kept deliberately incomplete. Even the most ambitious library ever assembled could not escape absence. The gaps in Ashurbanipal's collection remind us that knowledge is never total. What is missing shapes meaning as much as what remains. Here, silence becomes part of the archive. In Inscriptions and Royal Boasts, Ashurbanipal described his library in sweeping terms. He claimed to have gathered all the wisdom of the world, ancient texts, secret knowledge, the full tradition of the gods and kings before him. This claim was more than pride. It was political language. To possess complete knowledge was to possess divine favor. The king presented himself not only as ruler, but as guardian of all memory. Yet this completeness was symbolic rather than literal. No library could truly contain everything. Languages shifted. Traditions varied by region. Some knowledge was oral, some restricted, some already lost before Oshobonipol's scribes arrived. The claim of totality served another purpose. It discouraged challenge. If all wisdom already rested with the king, then alternative interpretations appeared unnecessary, even dangerous. By declaring the library complete, Oshobonipol transformed it into an authority. The collection became a standard against which other knowledge was measured. Here, the library was not just a mirror of the world. It was a statement about power, order, and control. Completeness was a myth, but a useful one. When the Assyrian Empire collapsed, Nineveh fell with it. The city was sacked, burned, and abandoned. Palaces crumbled. Roofs collapsed. What had been the center of imperial power became a field of ruins. And yet, the library survived. Not intact, not preserved by intention, but protected by catastrophe itself. As buildings burned and walls fell inward, thousands of clay tablets were buried beneath debris. Fire hardened the clay. Collapse sealed the layers. For centuries, the city lay silent. The empire that built the library vanished from memory, but the tablets remained, hidden underground, untouched by reuse or copying. This survival raises a quiet paradox. The library endured not because it was valued by successors, but because no one returned to reclaim it. Absence became preservation. Unlike scrolls or parchment, clay tablets did not rot. They waited. The fall of the empire, meant to erase its power, instead froze a moment of knowledge in time. Nineveh's library became a message sent forward by destruction itself. A reminder that loss and survival are often intertwined in unexpected ways. In the 19th century, explorers digging into the ruins of Nineveh began to uncover something extraordinary. Layer by layer, tablets emerged from the earth. Broken, scattered, yet unmistakably deliberate in their origin. These were Oshobonipol's texts, returning to the world after more than 2,000 years. As scholars pieced them together, forgotten stories resurfaced. The Epic of Gilgamesh, ancient flood myths, medical diagnoses, astronomical observations, voices long thought lost spoke again. Even now, many tablets remain unpublished. Some lie unread in museum storerooms. Others exist only as fragments, waiting to be matched with missing pieces. The library is still incomplete, not because it was destroyed, but because it has not yet been fully understood. Discovery did not end the mystery. It extended it. Oshobonipol's library survives as both a triumph and a reminder. A triumph of preservation through accident. A reminder that knowledge can sleep for millennia, only to awaken slowly, one fragment at a time. Somewhere along the Mediterranean coast once stood a place that became larger than its walls. The Library of Alexandria was not only a building, but an idea, the belief that all human knowledge could be gathered, studied, and preserved in one place. And yet, no one knows exactly how it ended. There is no single moment of destruction, no definitive fire, no clear culprit. Instead, there are layers of stories. A blaze during Julius Caesar's campaign. Gradual decline under later rule. neglect, dispersal, quiet dismantling. Each account explains part of the loss, but none explain it entirely. The scrolls did not vanish all at once. Some were likely damaged, others copied, some moved. Many simply disappeared from the record, leaving silence where titles once existed. What makes Alexandria's loss so haunting is its uncertainty. We cannot list what was destroyed, because we do not know what was there. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, poetry, histories of cultures that left no other trace, all possibly held, and now absent. The library's end remains unresolved, because it was not a single event. It was a long fading, knowledge slipping away slowly, unnoticed, until one day the world realized it was gone. Here, loss is not dramatic. It is quiet, and that quiet still echoes. As the original Library of Alexandria declined, part of its collection may have found a second home. South of the city's center stood the Serapeum, a grand temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis. Many scholars believe that scrolls from the main library were relocated here. Not all, but enough to suggest continuity rather than sudden disappearance. The Serapeum became an annex, a place where learning endured after the original institution weakened. Unlike the Mouse Ion, the Serapeum was more public, more visible, and more vulnerable. Its libraries were integrated into a religious space, blending scholarship with ritual. Knowledge survived by attaching itself to worship. This relocation may explain why Alexandria's learning did not vanish overnight. Teachers continued to teach. Texts continued to circulate. The idea of the library persisted, even as its original form dissolved. Yet this survival was fragile. The Serapeum stood at the intersection of belief, politics, and power. And where those forces collide, preservation is never guaranteed. For a time, knowledge remained, but the shelter was temporary. At some point in late antiquity, the Serapeum met a violent end. Ancient sources describe unrest, religious conflict, and destruction. And somewhere within those accounts, fire appears. But what exactly burned is unclear. Some descriptions suggest a warehouse of scrolls. Others speak only of the temple itself. No inventory survives. No list of losses. The word library appears, then disappears, leaving interpretation behind. If scrolls were present, how many were there? Were they remnants of the great library, or newer collections assembled afterward? The records do not say. Silence replaces certainty. What we know is that the Serapeum's destruction marked an endpoint. After this moment, references to Alexandrian institutional libraries fade entirely. Learning continued elsewhere, but the physical center was gone. The fire, if it consumed scrolls, did so anonymously. No titles mourned, no authors named. The loss remains abstract, felt more as absence than as record. Here, destruction becomes indistinct. The greatest loss in history leaves no clear accounting, only the knowledge that something immense slipped beyond recovery. After the fires and the silences, stories began to circulate. Stories of rescue. Some spoke of scholars who carried scrolls away before destruction came. Others imagined crates of texts quietly shipped to distant cities. Rome, Constantinople, Baghdad. Private collections absorbed what institutions could no longer protect. There is no proof, only hints. A text that appears elsewhere, with Alexandrian methods. A fragment that preserves a lost tradition. A citation that leads nowhere. These rumors persist because they offer comfort. The idea that not everything was lost. that somewhere, knowledge survived under a different name, in a different language. It is possible that Alexandria did not vanish, but dissolved. Its contents scattered into the wider world, influencing later science, philosophy, and medicine without carrying their original labels. If this is true, then the greatest library did not end. It transformed. Here, hope replaces certainty. We cannot confirm rescue, but neither can we dismiss it. Alexandria may still live, invisibly, inside other traditions, unrecognized, unnamed, but present. The Mouse-Ion was more than shelves and scrolls. It was a living space. Scholars debated. Lectures echoed through halls. Research unfolded in conversation as much as in writing. And yet, almost nothing remains. No detailed description of its rooms survives. No clear location can be traced. The lecture halls where ideas were spoken aloud have vanished completely, leaving no archaeological trace. This reminds us of something easily forgotten. Much of ancient knowledge was never written down. It lived in voices, gestures, questions, and disagreements. When the Mouse-Ion faded, that living exchange vanished with it. Scrolls can sometimes survive fire. Buildings can collapse and be rediscovered. But spoken thought leaves no imprint unless someone chooses to record it. Alexandria's greatest loss may not be what burned, but what was never written at all. The conversations that ended. The questions left unfinished. The insights shared only once. Here, loss becomes immeasurable. Not a number of scrolls, but a silence where voices once filled the air. Far from the great cities of empire, in the desert cliffs of northwestern China, a doorway was sealed and forgotten. Behind it lay what would one day be called the Library Cave of Mogao. Inside were tens of thousands of manuscripts, scrolls of silk and paper, Buddhist sutras, administrative records, calendars, music, prayers, and personal letters. Languages layered upon languages. Centuries compressed into one quiet space. The cave was not abandoned by accident. Someone chose to close it. The doorway was carefully sealed, hidden behind plaster and paint. And then it was left alone for nearly 1,000 years. When it was reopened in the early 20th century, the manuscripts appeared astonishingly intact. Dry desert air had protected them. Silence had preserved them. Mogao shows us a different strategy of survival. Not copying, not dispersal, but concealment. Here, knowledge endured because it disappeared on purpose. Why was the library cave sealed? No inscription explains the decision. No record names the hand that closed the door. What remains are possibilities, suspended in time. One theory suggests danger. In the early 11th century, the region faced political instability and the threat of invasion. Monks may have hidden the manuscripts to protect them from destruction or looting, intending to return one day. Another possibility is practical rather than dramatic. The cave may have become full. Older texts, no longer in daily use, were placed together in a respectful repository. In some traditions, sacred writings could not be discarded. They had to be stored, even if unread. Some scholars suggest ritual motives. Sealing the cave may have been an act of devotion, a way to withdraw sacred words from the ordinary world, preserving them in purity and silence. There is also the simplest explanation. The knowledge of the cave's contents may have faded. Generations passed. The door was forgotten. What began as temporary concealment became permanent. The uncertainty itself is meaningful. It reminds us that preservation does not always come from grand plans. Sometimes it comes from quiet decisions whose reasons vanish, even as their consequences endure. Here, intention dissolves. Only survival remains. High on the Tibetan plateau, within the walls of Sokya Monastery, knowledge waited behind stone. For centuries, a vast collection of manuscripts was stored in sealed rooms, hidden from sight. Some were stacked from floor to ceiling, untouched by time, dusted only by memory. These vaults were not secret in the sense of forbidden. They were simply closed. The monastery preserved its texts by withdrawing them from circulation, protecting them from war, climate, and overuse. When the rooms were finally opened in the modern era, scholars discovered an immense archive. Buddhist philosophy, history, ritual manuals, medicine, astronomy. Thousands upon thousands of works, some unknown, some thought lost. The sealed vaults of Sokya reveal another approach to survival. Knowledge was preserved by patience, by restraint, by allowing texts to sleep for generations. Nothing burned, nothing scattered, nothing copied obsessively. Instead, the collection endured because it was left alone. Here, preservation meant stillness. Knowledge survived not by movement, but by waiting. Among the manuscripts preserved at Sokya were works unlike most others. Large, heavy volumes bound with iron fittings, designed to endure. These texts dealt with the heavens. Astronomical calculations, calendars, predictions of eclipses, systems for measuring time. Knowledge that required precision, continuity, and protection. The iron bindings were practical. They kept pages aligned. They discouraged insects. They slowed decay. But they were also symbolic. They gave weight to the ideas inside. Astronomy was not abstract curiosity. It shaped ritual calendars, agricultural timing, and cosmological understanding. Errors mattered. Preservation was essential. By reinforcing these books physically, their caretakers acknowledged the fragility of knowledge and responded with solidity. The form supported the content. Here, preservation became craftsmanship. Knowledge was not only hidden or copied, it was armored. And so the movement of stars endured on Earth, held in place by iron and patience. Near the shores of the Dead Sea, in a landscape of rock and salt, a community chose carefully what to preserve. The scrolls hidden in the caves of Qumran were not random. They represent a selection. Biblical texts, commentaries, community rules, and interpretations that reflected the group's identity and beliefs. Other writings, common elsewhere, are absent. The collection tells us as much about what was excluded as what was kept. The scrolls were wrapped, placed in jars, and hidden deliberately. Whether to protect them from Roman forces, or as part of a ritual act, the intention was clear. These texts mattered. Qumran's library was not meant for the world. It was meant for survival. A message to the future, preserved by choice rather than completeness. Here, preservation was an act of definition. By choosing what to hide, the community shaped how it would be remembered. Knowledge endured, but filtered through belief. Among the jars found in the caves of Qumran, not all contained scrolls. Some were empty. At first, this seemed puzzling. Why prepare containers, carry them into remote caves, and leave them blank? The silence of these jars invites speculation. One possibility is loss. Scrolls may have decayed, been removed, or never survived the centuries. Organic materials are fragile, especially in moments of haste or fear. Another possibility is intention. The empty jars may have been prepared in advance, ready to receive texts that were never placed inside. plans interrupted, a flight unfinished. Some scholars suggest something more symbolic. The jars could mark absence deliberately, a recognition that not all knowledge could be saved, that preservation has limits. These empty vessels remind us that libraries are defined not only by what they contain, but by what they were meant to hold. Expectation lingers, even when content does not. Here, silence is physical. Clay jars holding nothing still speak of urgency, preparation, and uncertainty. They are containers for possibility and for loss. In the sands of Egypt, near the village of Nag Hammadi, a collection of texts was not hidden in a building or a cave. It was buried. The manuscripts were sealed inside a jar and placed in the ground, as if laid to rest. When discovered in the 20th century, they revealed Gnostic writings long thought destroyed or erased. Why were they buried? Fear is one answer. As religious boundaries hardened, certain texts became dangerous to possess. Burial may have been the safest form of concealment. There is also the possibility of ritual. Some traditions treated texts as living entities. When they could no longer be used openly, they were buried with respect, rather than burned or discarded. The Nag Hammadi library survived because it was removed from circulation entirely. It was not meant to be found. Its survival was accidental, made possible by dry soil and chance. Here, knowledge crossed into the realm of the funerary, preserved by being treated as dead, only to be revived centuries later. The earth became a bookshelf. Time became the guardian. At the foot of Mount Sinai, within the walls of St. Catherine's Monastery, texts endured not through burial or sealing, but through neglect of a gentler kind. Fragments of manuscripts accumulated over centuries. Old pages, damaged codices, and used translations. They were not destroyed, but set aside, stored in forgotten corners. Among them were parts of what would later be known as the Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest surviving complete Christian Bibles. Its pieces survived because they were neither celebrated nor discarded. The monastery's isolation helped. So did continuity. Generation after generation of monks preserved texts as a matter of habit, not urgency. Knowledge persisted through routine. Here, survival came from indifference rather than intention. What was not actively valued was still respected enough not to be erased. Fragments bridged centuries. A text became whole again only much later, when scholars recognized what had quietly remained. This is the final lesson of hidden libraries. Preservation does not always require secrecy or drama. Sometimes, it happens simply because no one interferes. Off the coast of a small Greek island, a corroded mechanism was lifted from the sea. At first, it seemed insignificant. Fragments of bronze, gears locked in green decay. But the Antikythera mechanism revealed something unsettling. It implied lost knowledge. The precision of its design suggested mathematical understanding far beyond what surviving texts describe. Gear ratios predicted eclipses. Cycles aligned with celestial motion. Such complexity rarely exists in isolation. This device likely belonged to a wider tradition: manuals, diagrams, calculations. A technical library now gone. The machine survived because it sank. The books that explained it did not. Here, absence becomes loud. A single artifact casts a shadow large enough to suggest shelves of vanished instruction. Knowledge once systematic, now reduced to a puzzle. Antikythera whispers of libraries that never left ruins, only implications. Carved into rose-colored stone, The city of Petra once thrived at the crossroads of trade. The Nabateans mastered water, stone, and movement. Yet almost nothing remains of their written culture. This absence is itself a clue. Such a complex society required records, trade agreements, engineering plans, ritual texts. A scriptorium must have existed somewhere within the city's carved corridors. But Petra's libraries left no clear trace. No shelves, no catalogues, only silence, shaped like knowledge that should be there. The likely explanation is material. The Nabateans used perishable media, papyrus, parchment, unsuited to long-term survival in open environments. When the city declined, its texts vanished with it. Petra's lost scriptorium reminds us that civilizations can be literate, yet leave no literary body behind. Knowledge can power greatness and still disappear entirely. Here, the ghost of a library lingers without a single surviving book. Water was Petra's greatest strength. Channels carved into stone, hidden cisterns, pressure-controlled flows, all designed to tame a desert. Some scholars believe this mastery extended beyond survival. That water systems may have protected knowledge as well. Sealed chambers, cooled by flowing water, could have created stable environments. Humidity controlled, temperature softened, ideal conditions for storing scrolls in a hostile climate. There is no direct proof. No scrolls have been found. Only architecture that suggests intention. Niches carved where water never touched. Vaults set behind hydraulic barriers. If such scroll safes existed, they vanished quietly. Floods, earthquakes, abandonment. Systems designed for protection became instruments of loss. Here, we glimpse a sophisticated attempt at preservation that left no surviving texts. Only the infrastructure remains, hinting at care once taken. Knowledge may have flowed through Petra like water itself, guided, contained, and finally absorbed back into stone. In the highlands of ancient Yemen, the Himyarite kingdom once ruled trade routes and cities rich with stone inscriptions and written culture. Their language was carved into rock, metal, and monuments. And then it faded. Archaeologists know the script existed. They can read parts of it. Yet entire bodies of Himyaritic texts are missing. What survives suggests far more once lay beneath the surface. Some writings may have been buried deliberately. Others lost as cities collapsed and were rebuilt. Climate and soil swallowed what stone could not protect. Unlike libraries of shelves and rooms, Himyarite knowledge may have lived in dispersed forms. Tablets, wooden boards, portable texts, now dissolved into the earth. Here, loss is geographic. Knowledge still exists, but underground, unread, awaiting chance discovery. A buried archive without walls. An entire written tradition survives only in fragments, reminding us how easily a language can slip almost completely from memory. Far to the east of the Mediterranean world, beyond mountains and deserts, Greek culture once took root in Bactria. Cities were founded, coins were minted, philosophy, administration, and science traveled with settlers and soldiers. Where there were Greeks, there were texts. Yet almost nothing remains of their libraries. Archaeology reveals traces of education and governance, but written collections have vanished. The materials were fragile. The distances immense. Successive invasions and cultural shifts scattered communities and erased institutions. Books likely traveled with individuals, rather than resting in permanent buildings. A library in Bactria may have been a chest, a satchel, a memory carried across borders. Over time, languages blended. Greek faded. Texts were no longer copied. Knowledge dispersed into other traditions or disappeared entirely. These are libraries without ruins. Ghosts traced only by influence. Echoes in coin inscriptions, artistic styles, mathematical ideas passed onward without names. Here, knowledge did not fall. It drifted, and in drifting, it became invisible. In the highlands of ancient Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum stood as a bridge between worlds. Trade connected it to Rome, Arabia, and India. Coins bore inscriptions. Christianity took early root. And somewhere within this crossroads of cultures, a great translation may once have existed. Some traditions suggest that Aksum possessed an early version of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, rendered into Ge'ez. If true, this would place Ethiopia among the earliest centers of biblical transmission. Yet no complete ancient copy survives. What remains are later texts, echoes of earlier forms, hints preserved in quotations and structure. Scholars sense an older layer beneath the surviving tradition, but cannot reach it directly. If an Aksumite Septuagint once existed, it may have been lost through climate, reuse, or transformation as texts were recopied and adapted. The original form dissolved into continuity. Here, the library is not gone in the usual sense. It lives on, altered, absorbed into later generations. The ghost remains inside the living tradition. Knowledge survives, but its earliest shape is no longer visible. Aksum's great obelisks once marked power, memory, and permanence. Carved from single blocks of stone, they rose above the city like frozen pages of history. Beneath them, the ground tells a quieter story. Archaeological evidence suggests that parts of ancient Aksum were affected by water over time. Shifts in climate, changes in drainage, and gradual flooding altered the landscape. Structures collapsed. Lower levels filled and sealed. Some scholars believe that archives once stored near monumental complexes may now lie submerged or buried beneath layers of silt and stone. Wooden shelves dissolved. Scrolls softened, then vanished. What remains is absence shaped by water. Unlike fire, which destroys visibly, flooding erases gently. Ink runs. Fibers weaken. Texts disappear without trace. If Aksum held archives near its ceremonial heart, they may still be there, not preserved like clay tablets, but transformed into soil itself. Here, loss is slow and quiet. Knowledge did not burn or scatter. It sank. The obelisks remain above ground, but the words that once surrounded them may sleep below, unreachable, absorbed into the earth. At the edge of the Sahara, Timbuktu became a meeting place of desert and river, of trade and learning. For centuries, scholars gathered there, copying texts on law, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Some of these manuscripts survive today. Many do not. What is less remembered are the libraries that preceded the famous collections. Earlier centers of learning, now lost to shifting trade routes, climate change, and political upheaval. Their shelves vanished without record. Sand does not burn books. It buries them. Wind relocates cities slowly, grain by grain. Knowledge can fade without drama, absorbed into the landscape. Timbuktu's surviving manuscripts hint at deeper layers beneath. Traditions built upon earlier ones. Texts copied from sources no longer named. Libraries whose existence is known only through citation. Here, the ghost is cumulative. Each generation inherits fragments of something larger, now unreachable. The Sahara keeps its archives without walls. And in its silence, the echo of lost libraries continues to move, carried softly by time. On the Bay of Naples, beneath meters of volcanic ash, a Roman villa slept for nearly 2,000 years. When it was rediscovered at Herculaneum, it revealed something no one expected. A library, not preserved by care or foresight, but by catastrophe. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, intense heat carbonized hundreds of papyrus scrolls. They did not burn away. They hardened, sealed in darkness. Yet much of what this library once contained is still unknown. Titles are missing, authors unnamed, shelves implied but not fully recovered. What we have is only a portion of what once existed. The villa likely belonged to an elite Roman family, possibly connected to philosophical circles. The scrolls suggest Epicurean thought, but that may be only one corner of the collection. Other rooms remain unexcavated. Other texts may still lie hidden. Here, preservation was accidental. Destruction arrived faster than decay, freezing a moment of intellectual life in place. Herculaneum reminds us that survival does not always favor what is most important. It favors what happens to be in the right place at the wrong time. Even today, most of the scrolls from Herculaneum remain unread. Their surfaces are blackened and brittle, fused by heat into tight coils. For generations, attempting to open them meant destroying them. The words inside stayed sealed, like thoughts trapped in time. Modern technology has changed this. Imaging techniques now allow scholars to peer inside without unrolling the scrolls. Faint letters emerge from darkness, traced by differences in carbon density. What might they contain? Philosophy, certainly, but perhaps more. Lost works by known thinkers. Commentaries that reshape what we believe about Roman intellectual life. Even entirely unknown authors. Some scrolls may preserve debates, lectures, or drafts never meant for wide circulation. Private thoughts rather than polished texts. A glimpse into how ideas were formed, not just what they became. The greatest secret of Herculaneum is not what we have read, but how much remains silent. Each unopened scroll holds the potential to change understanding, or to confirm what we already suspect. Here, knowledge survives at the edge of discovery. Not lost, not known. Waiting. Deep within the ruins of Herculaneum, hundreds of scrolls remain unopened. They lie together, packed tightly as they were on ancient shelves, an entire legion of texts frozen in formation. Some are intact. Others are crushed, warped by heat and pressure. Each one represents hours, days, sometimes years of human thought, compressed into fragile cylinders of carbon. Archaeologists believe that what has been recovered so far may be only part of the original library. Other rooms remain buried. Other scrolls may still rest beyond reach, untouched since the 1st century. The unopened scrolls are remarkable, not only for what they might contain, but for how they survived together. Unlike scattered fragments, they preserve a sense of context. A collection, a moment in intellectual history. They remind us that libraries are not just lists of texts. They are ecosystems of ideas, assembled intentionally, read side by side, shaping one another. Here, survival is collective. Knowledge did not endure alone. It endured as a group, waiting patiently for the moment when listening becomes possible. In some traditions, sacred writing could never be thrown away. Even when damaged, outdated, or no longer useful, texts were treated with care. They were set aside, not destroyed. This practice gave rise to something unexpected, the Geniza, A geniza was a storage space, often a room or a loft, where writings accumulated over centuries. Not only holy texts, but letters, contracts, shopping lists, school exercises, and personal notes. Anything that contained writing. No one intended to create a library. There was no plan, no catalogue, no selection. Life simply deposited its paper trail, day after day. When genizas were later opened, they revealed something rare. Not the voices of elites, but of ordinary people. Arguments, worries, business dealings, jokes, prayers. Daily life preserved by accident. Here, survival was unintentional. Knowledge endured not because it was important, but because it was written. The geniza teaches us that history is often saved by habit, not by foresight. What seems disposable today may become priceless tomorrow. As books were repaired, rebound, or reused, something unexpected began to happen. Older texts slipped into hiding. Pages from worn manuscripts were cut up and used as binding material. They reinforced spines, lined covers, strengthened new volumes. Words were folded inward, pressed between boards, forgotten. This was not concealment by intention. It was economy. Nothing was wasted. Parchment was valuable, and an unreadable text could still serve a physical purpose. Centuries later, these bindings began to reveal their secrets. When restorers opened old books, fragments emerged, legal codes, letters, poems, theological debates, preserved not by reverence, but by neglect. In some cases, the only surviving copy of a work exists as a scrap hidden inside another book. Knowledge survived by becoming invisible, embedded within something newer. Here, preservation took the form of camouflage. Words hid inside words. The past supported the future, literally holding it together. Libraries survived inside libraries, unseen, waiting patiently for hands to open them again. In one remarkable case, an entire medieval court archive survived inside a single book. The volume appeared ordinary, a legal manuscript, copied and recopied over time. But hidden within its pages were layers of reused parchment, fragments folded, stitched, and bound together. When scholars examined it closely, they realized these were not random scraps. They were records, court proceedings, witness testimonies, administrative notes. The working memory of a judicial system, compressed into one object. The original archive had likely been dismantled. Documents considered outdated were cut up and reused to strengthen a newer book. No one intended to preserve them. Yet in being repurposed, they escaped destruction. This accidental survival offers a rare view of everyday governance. Not laws as ideals, but law as practice. Disputes, agreements, voices that would otherwise have vanished. Here, knowledge endured by losing its identity. The archive survived only because it stopped being recognized as one. A single book became a silent container for many lives, many decisions, and an entire forgotten institution. In some places, survival came not from burial or reuse, but from being left behind. High above the ground, inside a church tower, a small library once stood. When access became difficult, when ladders rotted or stairs were sealed, the room was simply abandoned. Books remained on their shelves. Dust settled. Seasons passed. Centuries followed. No one removed the volumes. No one updated them. The collection froze at the moment it was last used. Theology, sermons, commentaries, all preserved exactly as they were when the door closed. This kind of library does not evolve. It does not grow or shrink. It waits. When such towers are rediscovered, they offer something rare, a snapshot. Not fragments, not copies, but a complete working collection, untouched by later reforms or revisions. Here, preservation came from inconvenience. Knowledge survived because it was hard to reach. Time moved on below, but in the tower, the past remained perfectly still. In the town of Medias in Transylvania, a church tower guarded more than stone and bells. It guarded a moment in religious history. Before the Reformation reshaped belief and practice across Europe, books filled the tower's small library. Sermons, theological commentaries, devotional texts, all written from a worldview that would soon be questioned, revised, or rejected. When reform arrived, these books were not destroyed. They were simply set aside. The tower closed, access ceased, and the collection remained untouched. For centuries, the voices of an earlier faith slept above the town. Not argued against, not corrected, just left behind. When rediscovered, the library revealed how belief was practiced before change arrived. Not through later interpretation, but through original texts, arranged as they once were. Here, preservation occurred at the edge of transformation. The old was not erased, only bypassed. The tower became a time capsule, holding theology as it existed before the world shifted beneath it. Some of the fragments discovered in Transylvania did not remain where they were found. As scholars examined bindings, towers, and forgotten shelves, pieces of older manuscripts surfaced. Pages written in unfamiliar hands, on parchment that did not match local traditions. Their origins lay elsewhere. Careful study revealed something unexpected. These fragments had traveled. They originated in medieval scriptoria far to the west, including Paris, one of the great intellectual centers of the Middle Ages. Books had crossed borders long before modern nations existed. Students carried texts home. Clerics traveled with manuscripts. Pages were reused, rebound, and reshaped far from where they were first written. What appeared to be a local fragment was part of a much larger circulation of knowledge, a silent witness to medieval networks of learning, now broken and scattered. Here, survival is accidental and global. A text written in one city, reused in another, rediscovered centuries later in a third. Knowledge endured by moving, by losing its original context, by becoming fragmentary. This final story of accidental survival reminds us that libraries are not fixed places. They are journeys. And sometimes what survives is not a book, but a path. In the ancient city of Antioch, one of the great intellectual centers of the Eastern Mediterranean, references appear to a library that no one has ever found. Ancient writers mention scholars, collections, places of study. They describe learning, debate, transmission. And yet, no physical remains clearly match these descriptions. This absence has puzzled historians. A city so influential should have left architectural traces. Shelves, inscriptions, catalogues. Instead, the library exists only in echoes. One possibility is destruction. Earthquakes, fires, repeated rebuilding erased evidence. Another is transformation. Buildings repurposed. Libraries absorbed into schools, churches, or private homes. There is also the idea of intentional obscurity. In periods of tension, certain collections may have been concealed, dispersed, or quietly dissolved to avoid attention. Antioch's Phantom Library reminds us that knowledge can flourish without leaving clear material footprints. Ideas can move faster than buildings. Conversations can outlast walls. Here, the library is real in influence, but invisible in stone. In the city of Stratonikia, the ground itself shaped how knowledge survived. Located in an earthquake-prone region, the city was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Walls cracked, roofs fell, public buildings collapsed and rose again, layered one atop another. Instead of abandoning the site, its inhabitants adapted. Structures were reinforced, foundations thickened, spaces were reused rather than erased. If libraries existed here, they would have had to endure this constant movement. Scrolls could not remain in fragile, exposed rooms. They needed protection, niches carved into stone, storage built into walls, spaces designed to flex rather than shatter. Earthquakes forced continuity through rebuilding. Knowledge was not left behind when the city fell. It was carried forward into the next version of the city, embedded into new walls. Here, preservation was architectural resilience. The understanding that destruction would return, and that survival required planning for collapse, not permanence. The city learned to remember by rebuilding itself again and again. Despite careful excavation, the places where Stratonikia's scrolls were stored remain elusive. Archaeologists have uncovered walls, columns, theaters, baths, and streets. They have traced phases of rebuilding across centuries. And yet, no clear library room has emerged. This absence has led to another idea: that texts were not kept in a single grand space, but distributed. Scroll niches carved into walls, small cupboards hidden within public buildings, storage integrated into temples, schools, or administrative rooms. Such niches would leave little trace. Wood rots, shelves vanish. Only subtle cuttings in stone might remain, easily overlooked or misinterpreted. If Stratonikia preserved knowledge this way, it did so quietly. No monument to learning, no declaration of importance, just practical spaces designed to survive tremors and time. Here, the library becomes architectural camouflage, knowledge stored where no one thinks to look. The absence itself may be the clue. What was meant to endure was never meant to be seen. As Stratonikia passed from pagan city to Christian center, its texts did not vanish overnight. They shifted. Temples became churches. Ritual spaces were reinterpreted. Older writings lost their original context, but did not always lose their value. Some were reread. Others were set aside. Libraries in such cities often lived double lives. Pagan philosophy might coexist with Christian commentary. Classical texts could be studied for language or logic, even as belief changed. Yet this balance was fragile. Over time, certain works became unacceptable. Others were absorbed, quoted, transformed. Knowledge survived by adapting its meaning. Stratonikia's layered identity suggests that its library, if it existed, was never singular. It evolved with belief, changing form as the city changed faith. Here, preservation was negotiation, between old and new, between forbidden and permitted, between memory and transformation. The city remembered by reinterpreting. Beneath the plateau of Giza, where stone monuments rise against the sky, a story persists, one that exists at the edge of archaeology and imagination. Ancient sources hint at a hidden chamber, a place where records were stored, knowledge preserved from a distant age. This idea came to be known as the Hall of Records. No physical evidence has confirmed its existence. No corridor has been found, no tablets uncovered, and yet the idea refuses to disappear. Some link it to Egyptian traditions of sacred archives kept beneath temples. Others to later interpretations, blending myth, esoteric thought, and misunderstood texts. The Hall of Records becomes a mirror, reflecting what each era hopes to find beneath the past. What is certain is that Egypt valued record-keeping deeply. Texts were copied, guarded, ritualized. Knowledge was power, and power was stored carefully. Whether beneath Giza or elsewhere, archives did exist, even if not in the form imagined. The mystery endures because absence invites projection. Where stone conceals, the mind fills space. Here, the deepest mystery may not be a hidden room, but our longing to believe that somewhere, complete knowledge still waits, untouched, beneath the ground. At Baalbek, in the mountains of Lebanon, stone reaches a scale that defies easy explanation. Massive blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, form the foundations of the ancient complex. How they were moved remains uncertain. How they were positioned with such precision is still debated. The answers lie beyond surviving texts. No manuals remain. No engineering treatises describe these methods. If technical knowledge existed, it was either never written down or recorded on materials that did not survive. This absence suggests something unsettling. That highly advanced practical understanding can vanish without leaving instruction behind. That skill can be lost even when monuments endure. Some imagine lost technical libraries, filled with diagrams and calculations. Others believe knowledge lived primarily in apprenticeship and oral tradition, passed from master to builder. Either way, Baalbek reveals a gap between what was built and what was recorded. The stone speaks clearly. The texts are silent. Here, the foundation itself becomes the archive, a physical record that cannot be fully read. The Voynich manuscript sits alone in history, written in an unknown script, filled with unfamiliar plants and strange diagrams. It resists every attempt at interpretation. Yet it does not feel like a beginning. The text appears confident, consistent, structured, as if the writer expected the reader to understand. This suggests tradition rather than invention. Some scholars suspect it belongs to a lost lineage, a technical or medicinal tradition now erased. Perhaps a private code, perhaps a regional script never widely adopted, perhaps the last survivor of a once larger library. If so, the Voynich manuscript is not mysterious because it is unique, but because it is lonely. Its companions are gone, its context erased. Libraries once gave meaning through proximity. One text explained another. Without that environment, meaning collapses. Here, mystery arises from isolation. A book without a shelf. A voice without a language community. The deepest mystery may not be what the Voynich manuscript says, but what else once existed alongside it, and has since vanished without trace. Even in the modern world, the idea of hidden collections has not disappeared. Occasionally, rumors surface. Restricted archives, uncatalogued rooms, private collections known only to a few, documents sealed for decades or indefinitely under the claim of preservation, security, or sensitivity. Most of these collections are mundane. Legal records, personal papers, administrative files, and yet the language surrounding them echoes the past. Knowledge withheld, access delayed, doors closed not by stone, but by policy. Secrecy no longer hides beneath temples. It lives behind procedures, permissions, and institutional walls. The mystery persists because knowledge still creates imbalance. What is known by some and not others shapes power, interpretation, and memory. In this sense, nothing has changed. Only the architecture. As centuries passed, libraries began to transform. Vast collections narrowed. Universal ambitions faded. Instead of gathering everything, institutions focused on preserving fragments. Documents became evidence. Texts became records. The library shrank into the archive. This was not a failure, but an adaptation. The world produced more information than could be held in one place. Selection replaced accumulation. Preservation replaced curiosity. Yet something was lost. The dream of total knowledge. The hope that somewhere, everything could be kept together. This is the historical echo that remains. From stone pillars to scroll rooms, from shelves to servers. The final question lingers softly. Was knowledge ever meant to be complete, or only continuously rediscovered? Among the thousands of tablets discovered at Ebla, many texts are administrative. Inventories, treaties, lists of goods and names. And yet, something is missing. References appear to incantations, rituals, spoken formulas meant to protect cities or invoke divine favor. But the words themselves are often absent. The tablets mention that such texts exist, without recording them. This omission feels deliberate. Incantations were powerful, spoken aloud, not meant to be frozen in clay. Writing them down may have been considered dangerous, or simply ineffective. Their power lived in performance, not preservation. Here, we see a boundary placed on knowledge. Not everything was allowed to be stored. Some things were meant to disappear after use, surviving only as echoes in administrative notes. The library, even at its earliest, was selective. It recorded what could be controlled. It left the rest in the air. Knowledge at the edge of history often reveals itself by what is not written. When Pergamum rose as a rival to Alexandria, it gathered texts with quiet determination. Scrolls arrived through purchase, copying, and exchange. Shelves filled with philosophy, medicine, drama, and science. And then gradually they disappeared. Historical references suggest that parts of Pergamum's collection were transferred. Some say gifted, others say seized. Rome is often named as the destination, but no list survives. No inventory marks the moment of departure. The scrolls leave the record silently. Perhaps they were absorbed into larger collections, losing their origin as they moved. Perhaps they were recopied, and the originals discarded. Perhaps they perished in transit, victims of damp, fire, or neglect. This uncertainty reveals a pattern. Libraries rarely end with a single event. They thin out. They bleed into other places. Their identities dissolve. Pergamum's library did not vanish. It dispersed. Knowledge at the edge of history often survives by changing its name. Across the cities of the Indus Valley, seals, tablets, and small inscriptions appear again and again. Carefully carved symbols, repeated patterns, a writing system used consistently across vast distances. And yet, no archive has ever been found. No room filled with texts. No shelves. No clear storage space devoted to writing. The script appears everywhere, but nowhere in abundance. This absence creates one of history's deepest silences. Perhaps texts were written on perishable materials, bark, cloth, wood, long since returned to dust. Perhaps writing served a limited function: trade, identity, ritual marking, rather than storytelling or philosophy. Or perhaps entire archives remain buried, still unmapped beneath modern ground. What troubles scholars most is not what we cannot read, but what we cannot find. A script implies continuity, training, memory, records meant to last. And yet, the material trace has vanished almost completely. Here, knowledge stands at the edge of visibility. We know it existed. We see its fragments. But the structure that gave it meaning is gone. The Indus script reminds us that civilization does not guarantee preservation. Even organized knowledge can disappear without leaving a shadow. At Teotihuacan, the great city of the Valley of Mexico, murals, architecture, and urban planning reveal a highly organized civilization. Knowledge shaped the city itself. And yet, no codices remain. Unlike later Mesoamerican cultures, whose books survived long enough to be destroyed by conquest, Teotihuacan's texts appear to have vanished earlier. Some scholars believe the city's inhabitants intentionally burned their own books during a period of internal collapse. If true, this was not destruction by enemies, but by choice. Books can carry authority. They preserve rules, lineages, cosmologies. In moments of upheaval, erasing texts may have been a way to sever ties with the past. Here, loss becomes an act of control. The silence left behind is striking. A literate culture that chose not to let its words survive. Knowledge released back into ritual, memory, and stone. At the edge of history, disappearance is not always accidental. Sometimes it is deliberate. In medieval Europe, stories circulated of lands beyond the known world. Among them, Vinland, a place described in Norse sagas, somewhere west of Greenland. Maps from later centuries show curious details. Coastlines that seem too accurate. Islands placed with confidence rather than guesswork. Features that suggest knowledge gained before official discovery. Some believe these anomalies reflect lost source materials. Early charts. Oral descriptions later copied into visual form. Others argue coincidence, or the creative liberties of medieval cartographers. What matters is the uncertainty. If earlier maps existed, they did not survive. If written descriptions were recorded, they were not preserved. What remains are echoes, distortions passed through generations of copying. Here, knowledge erodes gradually. Each retelling shifts detail. Each redraw alters meaning. At the edge of history, maps become memory, and memory reshapes the world. In Aksumite Ethiopia, Christianity took root early. By the 4th century, sacred texts were translated, copied, and read aloud in new forms. And yet, something is missing. References suggest that a complete Ethiopic version of the Septuagint once existed. A full translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, then rendered into Ge'ez. But no such complete collection survives. Instead, fragments remain. Individual books. Variations. Texts preserved unevenly across regions and monasteries. This suggests not destruction, but dispersal. Manuscripts may have been divided deliberately, stored in separate locations to protect against loss, copied selectively according to local needs. Here, preservation took a different form. Not centralized libraries, but networks of memory. The Phantom Septuagint of Aksum exists not as a single collection, but as a pattern, a shadow cast by many partial survivals. Knowledge at the edge of history does not always vanish. Sometimes it dissolves into pieces. Petra, carved into rose-colored stone, was once a crossroads of trade, language, and belief. Merchants passed through with goods, stories, contracts, and letters. A city like this did not function without records. And yet, No library has ever been clearly identified. Scholars suspect that a Nabatean scriptorium once existed here, a place where texts were written, copied, and stored. Perhaps tucked behind administrative offices, perhaps hidden within temples or carved chambers now eroded. What makes Petra different is not just that the library is lost, but that its disappearance feels complete. Unlike Alexandria or Pergamum, there are no scattered references to surviving scrolls. No later authors quoting Nabatean works. The textual voice of the culture fades almost entirely. Trade routes shifted. The city emptied. Knowledge moved with people, or was left behind without caretakers. Stone endured. Writing did not. Petra becomes a final image of disappearance. A city preserved in architecture, but hollowed of its words. Shelves without memory. Rooms without voices. At the edge of history, some libraries do not fall. They simply stop being remembered. In the highlands of ancient Yemen, the Himyarite kingdom once ruled over trade routes linking Africa, Arabia, and the wider world. Its people wrote in a distinctive script, carved into stone and recorded on perishable materials now lost. Archaeological traces suggest that some Himyaritic texts were not simply abandoned, but intentionally buried. Inscriptions speak of sealed deposits, ritual closures, offerings placed beneath floors or within foundations. Writing, in this context, was not just information. It carried power, identity, and authority. To bury texts was to protect them, or to remove them from circulation without destroying them. Climate and conflict later erased surface traces. Floods and sand covered what remained. What survives today are fragments, names, dedications, short declarations of rule. The larger works are absent. Here, preservation took the form of concealment. Knowledge entrusted to the ground, meant for no reader at all, or for one far in the future. At the edge of history, burial becomes a kind of hope, that what is hidden may someday be found, when its time returns. In the lands once shaped by Bactrian Greek culture, traces of libraries appear only indirectly. Coins bear learned symbols. Art reflects classical education. Inscriptions hint at administrative literacy. But the libraries themselves are gone. Bactria stood at a crossroads. Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian traditions overlapped. Knowledge moved constantly, carried by traders, scholars, and soldiers. Texts traveled with people rather than resting in monumental buildings. When empires shifted, so did language and script. Greek faded. New authorities favored new traditions. What had once been written was no longer copied. Here, knowledge did not burn. It migrated. Libraries dissolved into movement. Scrolls became baggage. Teachings survived only where communities remained to transmit them. When those communities scattered, the texts lost their anchors. This is the quietest form of loss. Not destruction, but dispersion without return. At the edge of history, libraries sometimes vanish because they refuse to stay still. Even now, the pattern has not ended. In the modern world, hints of hidden collections persist. Private archives sealed by families. Institutional holdings restricted indefinitely. Materials known to exist, yet inaccessible. They are not ancient, but they feel familiar. Once again, knowledge is gathered quietly, stored without display, preserved without promise of access. The reasons vary: protection, sensitivity, control, but the effect echoes the past. Some libraries do not announce themselves. They wait. This is where the journey ends, not with a conclusion, but with an open space. The understanding that knowledge has always existed at the edge of visibility. Some texts are lost. Some are hidden. Some are simply waiting for the moment when someone knows where and how to look. The mystery of forgotten libraries does not belong only to the ancient world. It is still unfolding.